Today, we're going to talk about 5 different tips to help all new and beginner candle makers early in their candle making journey. Now, these tips today are not going to be the physical process type of tips, an actual candle making. Rather, they're going to be tips more conceptually. I hope by the end of this video, you'll be thinking about candle making and your approach to your candle making in a new way, in a new direction that will save you time, money, and frustration. Hi everyone, my name is Wade Thomas. I am the owner of Black Tie Barn Candle Company, and I have been in the candle making industry for a little over 10 years now, and throughout that time, I've also been helping other candle makers get going in the same industry. In this channel, we focus on the candle making process, tips and tricks, as well as the business side of things as well. So if you are interested in learning more about candle making and candle making business, please subscribe below and hit the bell notification. That will alert you whenever I post new videos. So as I said, I've been making candles and selling them as part of a business for a little over 10 years now. Now, during that time, I have done a lot of things right and I've done a lot of things wrong. I've made mistakes along the way. I've learned from those. I've adapted. And the whole purpose of today's video, and actually all of my videos on my channel, is to help other candle makers kind of learn from previous mistakes and my own experiences to help save you some of those troubles and limit those mistakes by you going forward. Now, it is important to say that this particular video is 5 tips that it's not really about the process of candle making. This is more conceptual and behavioral tips and a way to approach candle making when you're getting started. And even if you are already candle making, but you're still a beginner or intermediate, then hopefully this video and these tips will help you out along the way as well. And lastly, before we get started, there are a lot more than 5 tips that I could give you. But for the sake of time, today we're going to cover 5 in this video, and we will cover many more in future videos. With all that being said, let's get started. Okay, so for my first tip, for all of you starting your candle making adventure, one thing that is very important is to be methodical. Be deliberate, be methodical, take your time. Now, let's break this down a little bit more. So first and foremost, like I just said, that being methodical also means being slow and deliberate. What I don't want is anyone to rush anything, to try to get something going too quickly. A lot of people are so eager to get started that they make 1 candle or 2 candles and they kind of like the way they turned out and they think, now I can start a business. And they start rushing things too quickly and trying to fast forward the whole process. Well, that causes mistakes to be made. It causes unsafe candles. It causes the candles to not necessarily perform well. It will affect your overall consistency. And that can really damage your reputation and really kind of hurt you before you actually even got started. So the first tip is just to be methodical, be slow, be deliberate. Now, during this time of being methodical and taking your time is all about research. And so this is all part of that tip number 1, being methodical and researching. Research, research, research. That means learn about waxes, learn about wicks, learn about fragrance oils, learn about what a properly burning candle should look like. And it will vary depending on the type of the wax that you're using and the size of the jar. So again, these are all things that you need to learn and consider during this phase of candle making. Now, this is, in my opinion, the most important part and most important phase of all candle making is learning the industry, learning the materials, testing, exploring. I'm going to do some other future videos on this entire process and how I go about this and the tips for researching and testing and future videos. But just know that most importantly is being methodical, taking your time, researching. If I had to give 1 tip and 1 tip only, that would be it. Because during that process of researching, you're going to learn a lot of other things that you need to know along the way, including some of these other tips. So first and foremost, research, research, research. You wouldn't try to lay down new flooring in your house or build a wall in your house or cook a new meal if you haven't done some prep work, right? And you haven't done some research yet. Candle making is the same way, except for probably more important because there are safety concerns. But again, if you really want to succeed in this business, you also need to worry about performance. And so before you get going, do your research and be methodical. Have a plan for everything you do. This will really save you some time and money down the road as well. Tip number 2, sample before you commit. What do I mean by that? Well, the number 1 ingredient that everyone starts with is wax generally. Everyone wants to start by choosing their wax. And a lot of people will just kind of do in their research step, they've kind of honed in on the waxes that are attractive to them. For whatever reason, everyone rates waxes on different factors. What's more important to them? And in fact, I have another video that I'll link up above and put in the description below that talks about these different factors and how you can weigh them to choose a wax. In fact, I actually built a wax selection worksheet that I'll link below. It's in that same video. It kind of gives you an opportunity to choose your wax based off the factors that are most important to you. And that could be the type of wax it is, hot throw, cold throw, ease of use, cost, all of those different characteristics. This worksheet will help you decide on the type of wax. But back to the point is sampling before you commit. And so when everyone's starting off by choosing their waxes, a lot of people just kind of base their entire selection off of what they have researched, which is a good starting point. But you never want to commit to that wax before you've had a time to actually sample it. So get a small sample of that wax and several others that interest you even in the slightest. Because you might think by reading that you are completely in love with a particular wax, and then you receive it and you try it and you might hate it by the time you're done with it. It might be too difficult to work with. You might not be able to get a good hot throw from it. It might not be suitable in your particular jars. You might have troubles wicking it. So there's all sorts of things that could go wrong, or at least alter your perspective on that wax. So definitely sample various waxes before you get started. The same thing goes for wicks. Now that's obviously going to depend on your wax and depend on your jar, but it's the same mentality. Definitely sample wicks. You're not going to pick one or two types of wicks and just use them across the board. That's not how wicking works, unfortunately. And I also have another video all about wicks that goes into wick theory in general, and also into the details of the different types of wicks and which waxes and containers they work best with. But regardless, after you've selected your waxes, do some research to find out what kind of wicks generally work well for those, and order sample packs of various wick types and various wick sizes. Now, I know this kind of goes without saying, but you'd be shocked how many people overcommit to their wax from the get-go and buy too much wax, and then they don't like the wax and they end up stuck with it. It happens all the time, and then they're trying to get rid of it and move on to another wax. Lastly, you need to sample your jars as well. We're going to talk about jars here in just a second, but the point is with jars is you might love the way a particular jar looks, but it could be a very difficult jar to actually wick properly, or one that's just hard for you to get consistently, or it costs too much. So figure out a few different jars that you kind of think you like, and maybe get a sample of those as well, 1 each, 2 each, just to get a comfort feel for how easy was this jar to wick. And once you have them in hand, it's very different than what you see online. So if you can't visit a local supplier and you're purchasing online, then sample a couple different jars and see which one you really want to start with. But the general rule here for number 2 and overall is just to make sure you sample things before you commit. This will save you time and frustration of having to try to swap things out and try starting all over again with new waxes and new wicks and new jars, but also definitely save you a lot of money. Number 3, KISS. K-I-S-S. Keep it simple, stupid. Maybe you've heard that term before. It's very common in business. It's very common in marketing. It's very common in general. It's a really, really good method to stick to keep you from getting overwhelmed and to keep problems from becoming over complex. So again, KISS stands for keep it simple, stupid. It really, really, really applies to candle making, especially if you're a beginner, especially if you're starting out, especially if you don't have help and you're not expanding a business. But even then, you still really want to follow a KISS kind of model. But starting out, what do I mean by keep it simple? Well, in the previous step, we talked about researching and sampling. All right. Now, those are very, very important steps, and they help lead you into step 3 of keeping it simple. Once you've done your homework, once you've sampled some things, make sure that when you're starting out, you really do limit yourself to 1 jar, 1 wax type. And I know this sounds potentially contradictory. In the previous steps, we talked about sampling a few kinds, but that's just for you to get started. Make sure you're choosing a wax that you're comfortable with. Make sure you choose in a jar that you like. That's what I meant by sampling. But once you've done that, once you've kind of honed in on what you do prefer starting out, you really need to then limit yourself to 1 of each going forward, at least for a while. It's too complicated to try to manage several different wax blend types for several different product lines early in your candle making journey. It's also very difficult to try to manage too many jars in your line. So my advice is to settle on 1 jar, master it, and really make that kind of the focal of your business starting out, if you plan to start a business. But even if you're not starting a business, if you choose one jar and really stick with it, you'll get really good at that particular jar. You'll really learn a lot about your wax and wicking during that process as well. What a lot of candle makers do earlier in the career, including myself, is I was so attracted to so many different jar types that I had a hard time settling on one. So I tried to end up making candles in way too many jars early on. Now, actually, I ended up going in the opposite direction as I grew and was in the industry more. I actually limited my jars the more I was in business. And that is not only a huge cost cutter, but a huge frustration cutter and stress cutter. And it also helps focus your business a little bit more and your branding and your niche. So again, do not try to do too much with different wax types or jar types. Once you've sampled and you've kind of found what you like, stick with that for as long as you can until you really, really are comfortable in your candle making and in your business if you have one. And then you can consider expanding down the road. Number 4, don't stress early on about your label. I know a lot of candle makers, when they're making their candles and they're working on their jars, they stress so much about their labels. They spend so much time, potentially a lot of money, trying to come up with a perfect label. Unfortunately, this is coming from experience. You're never going to find the perfect label. It just doesn't exist, because we're all so critical that anytime we make a label, we might love it, but we're going to find flaws with it. We're also going to just have change of hearts and want to mix it up. If you're like me and like most other candle makers, you're going to go through a billion different label concepts, and you're just never going to be sold on one, which is why you're going to always keep wanting to improve them, tweak them, make them better, add new label designs. And so if that is going to be the process anyways over time, then don't stress too much early on in finding the perfect label. Focus on your candle, your research, learning the process of candle making, strategizing, jar types. Think about all that. That's all more important than the label itself. You can start off with a very basic label early on, and then once you feel like you have other things down, then you can start working on the label and creating a design that you're really happy with. Then you can really start honing in on your label to make it exactly like you want, or potentially make multiple versions. And lastly, number 5, be organized. Now, this is really tough early on, especially if you don't have a lot of time or funds early on to help you with this process. But being organized is so extremely important that it's going to save you time and money down the road. So by be organized, I mean track your materials, track your products, take notes, make sure you're detailed in your testing documentation, track everything you can. When you're testing, how long your candle's burning, what oils you use. You can get as detailed as you want. And I'm not saying to overwhelm yourself and be overly detailed. My point is just to be organized. Have some way to track all your materials, your inventory, both materials and products, and definitely have a way to track your expenses. Even if you're not going to start a business, it doesn't hurt to track those expenses. Keep all those receipts, keep a spreadsheet, something to track them all, because if you do turn this into a business down the road, all of those startup expenses can be deducted. And so track them all. And ideally, it's best to do this with a separate bank account, especially if you're planning on going to business. Now, I do have another video that talks about taking the candle making hobby to a business, and I will link that in the description and also a link above as well to that specific video. And it goes over some of these steps in a little bit more detail, but all of that is part of being organized. If you're an unorganized person, kind of messy, or do things kind of by the seat of your pants, I would really, really encourage you, for the sake of candle making and for the sake of your candle making journey going forward, that you really hone in and get as organized as you possibly can. Take good notes, track everything. Okay, now I said this video was only going to cover 5 tips, but I got a bonus tip. I feel like I have to mention this other one, and I'll probably mention it in every single tip video, and that is wax and wicks are everything. Everything. If you don't get the wax and wick combination correct, it's going to stress you out and frustrate you more than anything in the candle making process for the rest of your candle making career or journey, period. I mentioned the video earlier about selecting a wax. I mentioned another video all about wicking. I really highly encourage you to watch those videos, and there'll be many more to come as well. But any candle maker will tell you that the most difficult part of candle making is wicking. So learning your wax and learning the wicking process and learning how to test the proper wick and what a wick should look like, what wicks to use and various types of waxes is by far the most important part of the actual process of candle making. And so even though the rest of these steps are more about guidance and behavioral and conceptual things when starting candle making, I would feel remiss if I didn't mention that you need to invest time and research into learning as much as you possibly can about wicks. Talk to other candle makers, watch videos like YouTube channels like this, ask others in groups, whatever you need to do. Test, test, test. And if you don't make candles and you only make wax melts, well then lucky you, because you don't have to worry about wicks, which is by far the bane of every candle maker's existence. All right, so those are the tips I have for you today. Now again, these particular tips obviously were not about the specific candle making process. I have some other videos that go into that a little bit, and I'll have many more down the road. But I really thought it was important for anyone considering candle making or ones that have already started to just kind of sit back and rethink your approach to candle making, because a lot of new candle makers just think to themselves, ooh, I think I could make a good candle. That seems really interesting to me. I really want to try it. And they jump right in. And there's nothing wrong with kind of jumping in and start experimenting, but don't dive in so steep that you hit head first. You really need to have a plan of attack, which is being methodical. You really need to sample some materials before you commit to anything. You also really need to keep things simple so you don't get overwhelmed. You don't need to worry about some other tedious things early on, like marketing and advertising and labeling. And lastly, you do need to be organized. So just kind of frame your mind when you're entering the candle making journey around those 5 steps early on, and I promise you'll be okay. You're going to learn so much more about the process once you get started, especially during step 1 of researching and being methodical, that is going to come. But if your mind isn't right from the very beginning, you're going to have a hard time with the rest of the process. While learning how to make a candle correctly and following certain steps and procedures and processes is critically important, nothing matters if you don't have the right approach from the very beginning. I hope that this has given you a little bit of guidance early on in your candle making journey to kind of get you on the right track going forward. Maybe even learn a little bit from my experience and past mistakes to limit yours. I really do think that these 5 steps will get you in the right mindset, the right frame of mind, and keep you from getting too overwhelmed and without spreading yourself too thin. Well, I wish you the best of luck. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and remember to subscribe and hit the bell, and we will see you next time. Thank you.